Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to see you today for today's topic on restorative practices. Restorative practices are one of my favorite topics, and I'm really excited that all of you have joined us today for this shared learning. This is being recorded. Feel free to drop any questions that you might have in the chat. And at the end of the webinar, I will end the recording and open this up for Q&A, and we'll be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. So my name, for those of you who don't know me, is Robin Short. I am the founder and CEO of Workplace Peace Institute, and I work really specifically as an organization systems design consultant. So what that means is I'm interested in how the design of a system influences the behavior of the people in the system. So I work very specifically with organizations to help them be intentional in their systems design so that we can have influences on the way behavior shows up, really specifically as it relates to cultivating peace and dignity in the workplace. I also support leaders in their own development, both in learning and development and leadership training and coaching. I work as a mediator and peace builder, which is where I developed my education and passion around restorative practices and restorative justice. I work as a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging consultant and really bring all of these disciplines together in all of the work that we do, with my greatest hope being that our work supports others in achieving their human potential. So this webinar series is specifically brought to you by the Workplace Peace Institute Leadership Academy. We have a variety of courses, both online asynchronous courses and courses that are delivered live in person or virtual. But all of our courses are really designed to optimize competencies in human behavior, helping people to develop more effective communication skills, conflict resolution, deepen their ability to work with proficiency with diverse spaces, to include optimizing equity and inclusion and belonging in our workplaces, so that we can all experience our basic human needs and our dignity needs. At its core, we're really focused on supporting leaders in creating workplace cultures where we all can thrive. We know that in order for businesses to thrive, the individuals in those businesses must thrive as well. So that's what we're very, very passionate about. And restorative practices are really key to how we do this. So today's learning journey, we're going to explore the foundations of restorative practices and their relevance in today's workplace. We're going to learn how restorative practices facilitate open and honest dialogue, how restorative practices can be used to build trust, to increase empathy, and really specifically collaboration within teams. And then we'll talk about various restorative practices, i.e. techniques and interventions. So to get started, I would like to just open with a definition of workplace conflict so that we have some shared language around that. So when we talk about workplace conflict, we are talking about a state of discord that's caused through the real or the perceived opposition of needs, values, and interest between people working together. When we have the experience of this opposition of needs, values, and interest in our workplace, it can be, it doesn't have to be, but it can be very destructive to our ability to collaborate and to get work done and to just produce the things that we're in our businesses to produce. So I come to this work in Workplace Peace Institute, I come to my whole understanding of how systems work through a conflict resolution lens. When I was early in my career working as a workplace mediator, it became very clear to me that the dysfunctions that were surfacing the dysfunctions that surfaced in a system would manifest through the human beings. And working as a mediator, my role was to support the human beings in their ability to navigate conflict. But I realized that there's a system that's influencing this. So what we're going to talk about today is both how we can integrate restorative practices into our organizational systems, but also how we can utilize restorative practices as a way of being in relationship with one another. So let's just talk for a minute about the human impact of conflict. Um, some of this data that I'm going to share with you today comes from a workplace state of conflict in the workplace study that we did last year. The most comprehensive study done around conflict in the workplace was actually done in 2008. And that's the data that we have been using and that many other people have been using. And obviously, 2008 was quite a long time ago. So last year, I went about gathering new current data that was really looking at many of the same data points that this 2008 study looked at. And what I found is there has been very little to almost no shifts in the data. So in the last 16 years, if I'm doing the math correctly, we haven't gotten that much better about understanding workplace conflict or navigating workplace conflict. And it does have a huge impact on us as humans and on the whole collective experience. So 82% of people agree that emotions run high when conflicts occur. That is one of the reasons why people avoid conflict, because many of us in Western culture have been conditioned in a way that we don't know how, we don't have a lot of comfort around emotional expression, particularly in the workplace. 88% of people witness poor morale among impacted employees. Quite a few people, the majority of people have experienced personal attacks. Almost 50% of people have experienced workplace bullying. Almost 50% have experienced sickness or absence due to workplace conflict. And nearly 25% of people have left an organization because of conflict. So it has a significant impact, and it's really critical that leaders and all professionals really deepen their capacity to navigate conflict effectively in the workplace. Um, every year, Gallup does a state of the global workplace study, and year over year, there's very little movement between the percentage of people who were disengaged at work. So from the 2023 report, 77 people are disengaged in the workplace. That to me is an astonishing loss of human potential. 32% feel demotivated, 28% feel angry or frustrated, 53% feel stressed. And I would say in 2025, these numbers are probably increasing based off what's happening in the world today. So there's a lot of triggers for workplace conflict, but here you can see what the top 10 workplace triggers are for workplace conflict: lack of trust, personality clashes, lack of role clarity, workplace stress, heavy workloads, destructive, ineffective communication patterns, people not having the experience of team cohesion, abuses or misuses of power, which also shows up in hierarchical decision making, and people not having adherence to an organization's mission and vision. So you can see in these top 10 triggers, the triggers to workplace conflict are going to have a significant impact on our capacity to actually collaborate with one another in the workplace. There are positive impacts of workplace conflict. If any of you are coming to this webinar As conflict resolution professionals, you probably have seen some of the kind of magical things that can actually happen when people have the skills to navigate conflict effectively. Navigating conflict in a way that supports peace, that supports human security, that supports our capacity to experience dignity in our relationships with one another. And when we do that, conflict actually leads us to having improved working relationships. It can lead us to identifying where there's weaknesses or vulnerabilities in the system so that we can make those systemic changes. It can help us to better understand one another, to find better solutions and problems to challenges. And conflict, when done well, actually supports us in increasing trust. So at Workplace Peace Institute, we don't advocate for conflict-free spaces. We don't even really advocate for harmony because we know a lot of beautiful and magical things can happen when we navigate conflict effectively. And we also know that conflict is a natural part of the human experience. But most of us need to build a lot of skills in order to do that well. And so that's what we're here today to talk about. Um, Before we do that, I just want to leave this little portion about conflict, sharing some information about the actual financial cost of workplace conflict. When we're not able to navigate conflict effectively, it can really hit the bottom line in a pretty destructive way. So, based off of our survey, based off of the survey conducted in 2008, on average, US workers are spending at least 2 hours per week dealing with conflict. That is an enormous amount of time doing nothing but engaging in conflict resolution. 15% say that they deal with conflict daily. 28% say that they deal with conflict frequently, and 53% say that they deal with conflict occasionally. But this has a pretty significant cost. So, according to the Bureau of Labor, the average US annual salary is just under $60,000. So, therefore, the cost of workplace conflict and lost productivity is about $3,200. I mean, $3,216 per year per employee. If you have an organization with 100 employees, you're looking at almost $322,000 in lost productivity every year. So there is a financial benefit to really intentionally infusing conflict resolution skills into the workforce. And I have found that restorative practices and restorative justice is one of the most transformative approaches to navigating conflict that does really truly meet that human need for security and the human needs for dignity and belonging. So, with all of that, let's take a look at restorative practices in the workplace. So I want to open this section, kind of bringing some connections to what we're here to really think about is how we can use restorative practices to increase workplace collaboration. So we can think about collaboration as sharing knowledge, sharing ideas, and sharing our expertise to achieve a common goal, to solve a problem, or to develop a process together. Workplace collaboration can increase efficiency, it can improve innovation, it can enhance productivity, and it can lead to better outcomes. And collaboration is relational. So when we have um, unresolved conflict in the workplace, we have jeopardized our capacity for relationship. And when we jeopardize our capacity for relationship, we jeopardize our capacity for collaboration. And in order for us to really achieve what we have come together in our workplaces to achieve, we have to be able to be generous with knowledge sharing and idea sharing so that we can be really effective in our problem solving. This is something I'm particularly passionate about because I believe that the challenges we are facing in 2025, the challenges that we have been facing in the 21st century, are going to require new ideas. The idea of like what got us here will not get us there. And many of the practices that got us here have been destructive practices. So, in order for us to increase our problem solving, we really do need to be able to increase our capacity for collaboration. And that means we really need to be intentional about relationships. So, from a definition perspective, restorative practices are a social science approach focused on building strong workplace. I'm adding workplace. Restorative practices are really primarily found in criminal justice and environments and educational environments, but I see tremendous value to the workplace. So I've been leveraging restorative practices in the workplace for over a decade. So wherever you see that I've inserted workplace in the definitions of things, this is really something Workplace Peace Institute is bringing to this body of work. So restorative practices are a social science approach focused on building strong workplace communities by prioritizing relationships, by fostering dialogue, and by proactively addressing harm when it occurs. So it's a framework for building collaboration as an actual competency. Um, Restorative practices are not a single thing. I really think about restorative practices as a way of being and a toolkit of interventions and a toolkit of practices that support this way of being in constant relationship with one another. So it isn't a single thing, but more as a framework for building relationships. It differs from restorative justice. So, restorative practices really emerged from the discipline of restorative justice. Restorative justice is a discipline that was born out of um, criminal justice here in the United States. But if we think about restorative justice and the roots of restorative justice globally, it is a approach to addressing harm and violation of community norms that really grew out of many indigenous practices. So restorative justice is a way of responding to harm that focuses on healing for the people who were hurt and accountability for the person who caused the harm. It gives people who have been most directly affected a chance to be actively involved in addressing what happened, repairing relationships, and finding a path forward. So, if we think about restorative justice in the workplace, oftentimes in the hierarchical institutions that most of us work in, when harm has been done, most of us have been trained or conditioned to take that grievance to someone who holds more institutional power. And then that person who has more institutional power, which might be a team lead, it might be a human resource person, it might be someone maybe in an educational environment that works in Title IX. But we've been conditioned to take our injury to someone who has more power, and then that person takes it and implements some sort of process that tends to lead to some sort of punitive outcome. What restorative justice offers is engagement. So the person who has been harmed is directly involved in the process of restoring that harm, and the person who's responsible for the harm is directly involved in the obligation of repairing harm. So when we bring restorative justice to the workplace, we are bringing people together to transcend that injury and to build some sort of plan that's going to repair harm and meet the needs of the injured person. So you can think about restorative practices as a proactive way of being in relationship with others. So if we think about restorative practices in the workplace, in every relationship, in every moment, we are bringing a restorative lens to the relationship. Then, if harm happens, if there is an injurious event, Restorative justice is a reactive practice that supports us in continuing to sustain relationship with one another. So these two disciplines live together. They have a lot of overlapping qualities, but they are a little bit different. You may at times see the words used interchangeably, but what I really want you to get from this piece is that restorative practices are a way of being in relationship so that we reduce potential for harm, and then restorative justice is reacting to an event where harm has happened. So there's 5 core tenets of restorative practice. You'll see these tenets show up in the discipline of restorative justice. But for our purposes, I want us to think about these practices as ongoing ways of being in relationship with one another. So restorative practices as a social science and as a discipline primarily has a focus on relationships. The core idea is that people in relationships are valuable. We see value in the humans that we are with, and we see value in the interdependent nature of the human experience. And when harm occurs, the goal is to heal those relationships. So if we think about this tenet from an ongoing practice, then I'm being consistently aware of the impact that I'm having in a moment-to-moment basis. So in the study that I have done with an organization called the Right Use of Power Institute, which I highly recommend if you are unfamiliar with the institute to look them up and maybe participate in some of their trainings, they do a really beautiful job of discerning the difference between responsibility and accountability. And when we talk about responsibility, we're talking about this in the moment, real time tending to harm that might be happening. So if I could see all of your faces and I said something and I registered, oh, that didn't land exactly right, then responsibility is in real time tending to that. And accountability is it's been brought to my attention on the back end, and I am repairing harm because I have realized after the fact that harm has been done. So when we think about focus on relationships from a restorative practice perspective, it's these in the moment, real time, ongoing tending to the health of the relationship. So where there's like small eye injuries, I'm seeing those and I'm tending to them, which means that I'm also being very intentional about my ongoing education, my ongoing learning, and my intentionality about building real relationship with people who are different than me so that I actually have capacity to be a responsible and accountable person in relationships. The second tenet is community building. So these are practices that are used proactively to create strong community bonds and strong social connections. In our work at Workplace Peace Institute, when we do cultural audits with organizations, what we find over and over again is there's a deep desire for what I have named as fellowship, but what it's really is, there's a deep desire for us to be able to come together and build community together. In our in the world that we live in today, where many of us are working in fully remote environments, and where many of us are working in hybrid environments, and where many of us are working in organizations where time feels like a constant um, like lack of resource, our ability to be intentional about building community has been particularly challenged. And it's a really critical piece of restorative practices. So an organization that is prioritizing restorative practices will be prioritizing ways to build strong community bonds. And this can happen at the team level, it can happen at a departmental level, but hopefully it will happen at an organizational level. The third tenet is a commitment to repairing harm. So when wrongdoing happens, the emphasis is on understanding the impact of the actions, taking responsibility, and finding ways to make amends. For us to be able to truly be in relationship where we have the ability to repair harm, there has to be strong relationships and there has to be strong community bonds, or we will likely not have the psychological safety necessary to name when a harm has happened. So, in order for us to name that harm has happened, give another person the actual um, ability to take responsibility, there needs to be a feedback loop available. There are times where a person does harm, they have no idea that they have done harm. And if we aren't in strong relationship and building community, we very likely won't have feedback systems in place to share with that human being how their behavior affected us. So these things are all very interrelated. The fourth tenet is empowering people. So restorative practices provides a platform for everyone to express their feelings and for everyone to participate in finding solutions. When I think about the concept of empowerment, for me, that definitionally is that as humans, we all have personal power, but we also live in systems that can make it difficult for us to access our personal power. So empowerment is really being in relationship with people in such a way that they're able to tap in, express, and fully embody the power that they inherently have. And then the fifth tenet is accountability and support. So individuals are held accountable for their actions, but they're also supported in learning and growing from mistakes. So many of us have been conditioned in a world, both like the actual societies we live in and the organizations that we go to work in, where accountability looks like punishment, that justice is punishment. And from a restorative practices perspective, accountability is being given the space to make amends, to understand the mistakes that you made and the harm that came from that, and that is done in such a way that I have the ability to learn and grow from mistakes. Humans do not learn well in the emotion of shame. So restorative practices are one of the reasons that what relationship building, community building, focus on empowerment and harm repair is so critical is that it creates opportunity for accountability to be safe and for accountability to be presented in a way in which we're all going to learn and we're all going to grow so that the behavior isn't repeated and so that the injuries of that behavior have the ability to heal. So there are some common practices associated with the discipline of restorative practices. One is restorative circles. Anyone can lead a circle. Um, this does not have to be, I think some basic training in circle facilitation is important and necessary, but you do not have to have a master's degree in restorative practices to lead a circle. A circle is simply a facilitated group conversation where colleagues listen deeply to each other and work toward mutual understanding. So many years ago, I worked at an organization that was one of the most toxic places I've ever experienced. My husband would joke with me and say, I think you work at The Office, like the TV show The Office. And as I reflected on that, I was like, I think that's exactly where I work. And one of the challenges, there were many, many challenges in that organization, but one of the challenges in that organization was there was no formal system for knowledge sharing. And because the organization was such a toxic environment, there was also a lot of high turnover. So without a formal system for knowledge sharing, the knowledge was walking out the door on a pretty routine basis. And it was a real business imperative that we find a way to retain that knowledge. And we also needed to build relationship with one another, build community, and have the ability to navigate the harm that was happening inside the organization. So every Friday, my team had a restorative dialogue circle. Every Friday, it was the last thing we did before we left for the week for the weekend. And the purpose of the circle, so restorative circles are always going to have a purpose. If you lead a restorative circle, you're designing it in a very intentional way so that it meets its objective. And our objective was knowledge sharing and relationship building and increasing psychological safety. So every week it was the same questions. Um, what uh, what did I achieve this week that I'm really proud of? So we could build relationship around successes. What did I learn that would be helpful for others to also know? And um, what mistake did I make? And then what support do I need? And that mistake and support questions were really important. We never ever punished mistakes. It was always done, was always shared from the perspective of, okay, if you made that mistake and now we're all learning from it, we're reducing the likelihood that that mistake is going to happen again. And then there were opportunities to request for support. And our team became an extremely collaborative, high performing team to the point that other leaders in the organization were coming to our department to get an understanding of what was happening, what's happening over here that's so different everywhere else. Another restorative practice is something called restorative conferences. And this is something where you would need training to lead a restorative conference, or you would maybe want to bring in a facilitator to support a restorative conference. But this is a formal meeting that brings people together who have been affected by harm to agree on how to repair the harm. So this is similar to a mediation. What's different from a restorative conference and a mediation is that there is really a clear victim and clear accountability. So it's not necessarily something where there's been mutual contribution. So what we're looking to do is ensure that the person who has um, intentionally or unintentionally done harm has the opportunity to take accountability, has the opportunity to repair, and has the opportunity to make a commitment on how things will be different. And the person who has been harmed is able to transcend that harm and experience healing. One of the concepts that are really core to both restorative practices and restorative justice is that only the harmed party can name what what's necessary for repair because we all experience harm differently. So in a light-hearted way, an example that I share around this is if my house was broken into and someone stole the TV, repairing harm for my husband would likely look like a new TV. Repairing harm for me would likely look like, how do I feel safe in my home again? So the same event can happen to 10 different people, and what reparations looks like will likely be 10 different things. And in most of our communities, whether that's a work community, a local government, national, repairing harm is something that someone with more power implements. So we say for this violation, this is what accountability looks like. And it's usually punitive and it usually leaves out the needs of the person who has been harmed. And then we have humanistic mediation. So humanistic mediation is a form of mediation that's really looking to support people who have experienced conflict in a way of transcending that conflict together by developing mutually agreed upon resolutions. So this is going to differ from a restorative conference in that there may not be a injured party and an accountable party, but mediation might look more like there has been differences of values, differences of needs, differences of perceptions that have been butting up against each other that's preventing us from progressing our work forward and maybe is causing us to produce some narratives about ourselves. And humanistic mediation brings people together in dialogue to support co-creation of agreements that can be sustainable. And then affective statements. So this is simply using language that expresses how someone's behavior makes them feel without placing blame and making others defensive. So an easy example of this is many years ago when I was working in that very toxic environment, there was a leader. He was a co-founder of the organization. And he demonstrated a lot of behaviors that many people would say look like bullying behaviors. He was a pretty tough person to be in relationship with. And he was also a very large man in an agency that was primarily women workers. And one of the things that he would do is he would slam his hand down on the table as a way of making a point, to be very demonstrative in what he was saying. And it would make me feel like a sense of terror would sort of rise up in my body. And it would cause me to have a difficult time actually listening to what he was saying. And so an example of an effective statement was me saying, hey, when there's like a slamming of hands on the table, it makes me feel a little bit jittery and a little bit afraid, and it makes it difficult for me to really understand and hear what the content is that we're trying to talk about. So I was able to name the behavior without putting this person on the defense. So what you're going to see as this common thread throughout all of these restorative practices is dialogue, is our ability to have dialogue with one another. And the definition of dialogue that I work with, that really comes from like the Greek words of the word dia and logos, is that dialogue is um, thinking together in relationship. So, dialogue, inherent to dialogue, is our ability to collaborate through relationship. And dialogue and relationship are the theme to all of the restorative practices. And so you can implement restorative practices in your daily work life simply by designing ways to bring people together to think together in relationship for the benefit of our ability to navigate conflict productively so that we can collaborate together effectively. Um, there are some probably obvious benefits of restorative practices. We have an improved workplace climate. So when we are being in relationship in a way, when we're being in relationship with one another in a way, we're being tentative and focusing on relationship, we're being intentional about building strong community. We're being very aware of and attentive to when harm has been done, and we're taking responsibility and accountability in an ongoing way. We have an environment that's more positive and safe. We have increased engagement. We become one of those organizations that Gallup studies that's this magical 23% of people who are actually engaged in the workplace. We feel more connected with one another and we experience more belonging. All of these things, our ability to experience safety, engagement, connectedness, and belonging, our nervous system responses to places where we feel safe. And that's really, really critical to effective cognition, to effective problem solving. We also have enhanced social and emotional skills. So, as we prioritize restorative practices in the workplace, we develop more empathy. We are comfortable being assertive because we know that we have the strength of relationship and the strength of community to be able to speak directly and to communicate directly because we're not worried that People are going to bring another story or another narrative to that. And we have increased conflict resolution skills. And we have built resiliency in the relationship so that our capacity to do conflict together has been built. And we simply just have stronger workplace communities. So it fosters greater trust, it fosters greater collaboration, and increased accountability among colleagues. All of these are critical to our ability to collaborate effectively with one another in the workplace. So, as we wrap up, I want to lift up that we do have an online course in our online leadership academy on restorative justice in the workplace. This is a course that I teach. It's fully asynchronous, but there's a lot of opportunities for engagement in the community of practice. And there's also a engagement manager, which is a real life human being who is supporting you as you go through the course. It's an 8-hour course, and it provides you with a lot of information that will support you in some of these interventions, particularly around leading dialogue circles. And then we have a lot of other courses that will support you in your leadership intelligence, the ability to be mindful, compassionate leadership. I think that in the world we're living in today, being trauma-informed leaders is also, I would go so far as to say, a moral imperative as well as a business imperative. We have courses on conflict engagement and diversity, equity, and inclusion.